Hello and welcome to my channel. In this video, I'm doing something just a little bit different that I've never done before, which is actually a joint review. And the reason I'm doing this is because the two books I'm going to be talking about are Witches Abroad and Small Gods. I've seen other people do like them. I'm going to talk about two different books in one review video, and usually I just like to focus on one, but with Discworld novels, it usually just kind of depends how much I have to talk about. They tend to be some of my shorter reviews, so I thought, why not, when I read two Discworld novels in July, kind of, to be fair, I read Small Gods in August because I was running super behind, but I read them back to back. They're both Discworld novels. They're very different, though, but I figured it'd be a good time to try and kind of combine them together. So I'm going to talk about Witches Abroad first, because that is in order. I'm doing publication order for all my Discworld novels. And this, as you can tell from the name, I'm sure, is a witches novel. And with this one, I had really been enjoying the witches parts. Starts with Equal Rights and then Weird Sisters, and this was the third one. And I definitely liked Weird Sisters more than this. But as I talked about in my wrap-up, I feel like with this book, we still have a lot of like really silly humor, but some more serious notes as well. There were definitely some put in there, and that really kind of, I felt like, showed where we were going to go with Small Gods, which was fantastic. So in Witches Abroad, we're following, of course, Granny Weatherwax, Nanny Ogg, and Magret, but with a little bit of a twist, because we find out that this fairy godmother basically dies and then leaves the charge of becoming her replacement fairy godmother to Magret, which of course Granny Weatherwax and Nanny Ogg do not think was a good decision, as they still see her as like the young upstart who doesn't take things seriously enough. They end up having to go a cross-country trip, there's your Witches Abroad, traveling to go to this city in order apparently to stop a prince, or stop a girl from marrying a prince. And the kind of the base plot that they're trying to stop is very, very obviously based on Cinderella. There are a lot of other little plays on different types of fairy tales, or just tales in general, from vampires to Little Red Riding Hood to all kinds of different things. There was like a Goldilocks and Three Bears mentioned. But a lot of what this focuses on is stories, what stories are, and like the power of stories. And it's the idea that like stories are a real thing. Like all the stories you hear, or like urban legends, things like that, they're all true, and that's why they become urban legends, basically. And so stories do like have kind of, not quite a consciousness, but like a will, basically, to have things turn out the way that they're supposed to. And so we have, of course, our witches trying to stop a story from turning out the way that it is. But we do get some of the normal like commentary, because there's always that in there as well, about how they just go, and Granny Weatherwax especially is not a fan of anything that's foreign, and they go around grumbling, not speaking the language. There's a lot of jokes where they badly say things that are just kind of referencing how you would see English-speaking travelers like butcher languages, or like just think that if they talk slow enough, someone who doesn't speak their language is going to understand. Things like that. We get a lot of play on that in travel. And we don't get like the full-on, kind of cheesy, like, I guess traveling wasn't so bad type thing. But you definitely see it's more subtle with the way that the witches grow, especially Granny Weatherwax grows with kind of accepting the other cultures to an extent, and actually wanting to do some more travel, despite the fact that she complained the whole amount out. And just kind of reminded me of the old, the secret to ending prejudice basically is to travel, because when you actually see other people and get to see other people as just people, you tend to lose some of that. So we kind of had that going on as well. And then just a lot of talk with mirrors as well, because some of the magic that plays with kind of the villain is very involved with mirrors also. And it was an interesting time. I think for me, this is one of the ones where I'm not a huge fan of fairy tales, and so when we're kind of doing satire and parody around fairy tales, the other fun part though is the fairy tale city is also like New Orleans-esque, which is very intentional, and so there's like lots of talk about New Orleans type things. And you get that a lot too. So it really is that odd mishmash that, of course, only Pratchett's going to give you. And this one, like I said, it was really well written, and that was the thing. It wasn't as funny as Weird Sisters. It was probably a better story, though, and the storytelling is something that I really, really enjoyed. I did with this one, I usually, when I'm reading Discworld books, I will put a little marker in for quotes that I think are some of my favorite of just mostly the jokes. Usually not particularly serious. I did do that with Witches Abroad, so let me grab those really quick. So the first is just because it's really ridiculous and silly, and it's just the kind of line that I'm like, did I really just read that? We have, from the trees around the clearing, the snakes and birds watched silently. In the swamp, the alligators drifted like patches of badass water. So that's the first one. Very silly. Just one of, there's always at the beginning of Discworld novels, there tend to be like the really kind of just random one-liners, which are always fun. So that definitely qualifies as one of those. Let me grab the next one here. So the next one is a footnote, which happens a lot with these, especially with the early on ones, and of course with no context. But this one is pretty self-explanatory, talking about bad spelling and kind of a further of the joke about how grammar and spelling are so important. But we have, bad spelling can be lethal. For example, the greedy seraph of Al-Yibi was once cursed by a badly educated deity, and for some days everything he touched turned to Glod, which happened to be the name of a small dwarf from a mountain community hundreds of miles away, who found himself magically dragged to the kingdom and relentlessly duplicated. Some 2,000 glods later, the spell wore off. These days, the people of Al-Yibi are renowned for being unusually short and bad-tempered. Alright, and so here the last one, once again, of course, no context, but just was silly and made me laugh. Mrs. Goggle shook her head sadly when the cook had gone. A voodoo woman was reduced to all sorts of stratagems in order to appear knowing, but she felt slightly ashamed of letting an honest woman believe that she could see the future in a pot of gumbo. Because all you could see in a pot of Mrs. Goggle's gumbo was that the future certainly contained a very good meal. She'd really seen it in a bowl of jambalaya she'd prepared earlier. So those were just 3 quotes that I thought were a lot of fun out of Witches Abroad. Like I said, I really enjoyed this one. I did like Weird Sisters more just because the kind of Shakespearean theater parody satire worked better for me than the more fairy tale-esque type of satire. But honestly, it's just Discworld books, especially, I've gotten to the point where even if I like it less, it's not one of my favorites, they're still really good, so I don't have anything to complain about. So that gets me, though, now to Small Gods. And Small Gods has to be one of my absolute favorite Discworld novels I've read so far. Definitely as like a standalone, I think it's very safe to say that it's my favorite by a mile so far, as the ones that are just kind of out on their own. And this one is, I looked at, it's considered part of like the ancient civilizations kind of group, which also Pyramids was one, where it was just a standalone, even though a lot of the areas are referenced later. And this takes place in kind of like an ancient city where it's an empire run by religious figures who worship the great god Om. And we follow, throughout the story, Brutha, who is a kind of dim-witted novice who just, like, all he wants to do is just, you know, do his chores and just not get in any trouble or do anything really. And he is a unique young man, though, in the fact that he has an eidetic memory, like, to probably a degree further than even what's, like, possible in the real world, where he just basically remembers everything. He listens, he remembers everything, and that comes into play. But things are kind of turned upside down for him when all of a sudden a tortoise appears in the garden that he's tending, saying that he is the great god Om, and Brutha appears to be the only one that can hear him. The story goes on from there. We get to see kind of what the whole setup of the empire is. There's a ton of discussion on the philosophy of gods, and oddly enough, considering this is a Pratchett novel, and the comparison is going to be wildly, wildly different, the kind of ideas on the nature of gods, how they're created, how they exist, and how they kind of die off, so to speak, reminded me a ton of some of the like mid to later Malazan books, where Stephen Erickson explored it in probably a much more serious way, I'd have to say, of course, but explored some of the similar ideas, where basically like gods are in a lot of ways created by their followers. The more followers they have, the more strength there is in the belief, the stronger the gods become. And then eventually gods tend to kind of like flow together. Like, there are comments like, every, buddy's got a thunder god, and they're all the same one, and there's jokes about, like, just wears, like, different wigs or stuff. But kind of we see that, because we know in the Discworld that gods are absolutely real, but getting kind of more into the nature of them, and the idea of small gods, which does still harken back to, we know in Ankh-Morpork there's a ton of gods, including small gods, and they even have small gods days. So it's another one of those things, when you read in publication order, there is so many comments and little asides or just things that seem like they're going to be nothing, and then you get to later books and there's whole stories kind of based on them. So it's just, the way everything weaves together is really fantastic. But this story, like I said, it does do really a ton of kind of the religion, the politics, and exploring philosophy in general. We do get some time in a city too, where, I guess I can say the name of the city, because we have Sort and Jelly Baby, of course, are the nearby cities here as well. And so Pyramids took place in Jelly Baby, which still makes me laugh, because when I was first trying to figure out how to say that word, and then I realized that it's literally Jelly Baby, just spelled to make it seem like it's an ancient civilization, always is just a fun laugh. But we're kind of like out in these desert nations and everything, and taking a look at what happened, and looking at the idea that even though there's this huge following of people who at least apparently follow a certain religion, worship a certain god, doesn't mean that they necessarily really believe. And I definitely think that is a pretty big criticism that Pratchett was putting on modern religion as well, where you do have a ton of people who claim to follow some faith, and it seems questionable whether or not a lot of them do. That's something we see. So there's usually a bit of that criticism and that in the satire. Pratchett definitely likes his biting satire, where it's satire and it's fun, but there's all that commentary in there as well. And so kind of comparative religion and politics, philosophy, and a lot of these ideas are explored here. And it's done really well is the thing. This definitely was not like a hilarious book like some of the other ones have been. There are definitely still a lot of laughs in it, and just there's silliness that goes along, and that's kind of what Pratchett's the master of, is he can have a book like this where there's all this serious philosophical conversation, and it's still fun and interesting and done in a way to make it just a really good novel and interesting to read. And this is one that I just really enjoyed. The other big thing that I want to mention is that I absolutely loved it. And this is something that it's not quite immediate in the book. I'm not really considering a spoiler, but you can go about 10 seconds forward if you don't want to hear it. But there's this whole big movement where people are arguing that the world is flat, and the religious people are saying, no, it's a sphere, it has to be a sphere. And just the parallel of that in the real world with flat earthers, but the fact that Discworld actually is flat, it just kind of like used a device like that to add humor to it while still having the commentary. And this just seriously was such a well-written book, and I enjoyed it so much. Like I said, one of my favorites. Absolutely recommend this one. I don't think I've heard a few people say that it's a good starting point. I wouldn't say that, because though I think this definitely shows where Discworld is going, you don't like a lot of the silliness and more of that I feel like you get in some other books, but this is just really a fantastic one. Like I said, one of my favorites I've read so far. I will actually note, so I commented with Witches Abroad. Usually I kind of like mark off funny quotes, and a lot of the times I do it kind of early on because there's a lot of zany stuff in the setup, and then as I get in, I just get too caught up in the book and I forget to do it. That happened right away. I have no markers in Small Gods, not that there weren't funny lines. There were times I definitely thought about it, but I just was pretty pulled in right away, and this one had less of the silly setup and more kind of just got right down to business into the story. And I honestly forgot, and I didn't even realize that I didn't mark anything until the point that I was filming the video. And I'm like, I didn't even mark anything in this one. So I don't have any quotes for it, but I mentioned a few things already about the kind of things that it looks like. And we do have there's some other fun little like Easter eggs, tie-ins, even though this is an ancient civilization. There are some characters that'll feel familiar. Specifically one character, which I won't say because it's not really a spoiler, but it'll be more fun if you haven't read the book, if you find it out on your own. But a character that's suspiciously similar in name to a character that we've seen in a lot of other Discworld novels, and you will, if you've read any of the ones with him in it, you will immediately know who it is and who it's talking about. And it's something too, you've kind of gotten other mentions of people with a name or a similar name in some of the other ones, which is just kind of like a fun little thing once again when you do the publication order. But we do, like I said, just kind of find out more about the nature of the gods in Discworld, and a really, really great story, and just kind of the way it ends too. It ends on a pretty serious note, actually, but it's very, very satisfying. And I just want to reiterate that I am so happy with the direction Discworld has been headed, because I feel like it really started for me with Reaper Man, which I thought was over there on my shelf, but it's not. It's actually over here. Reaper Man still had a lot of like the kind of silly humor and even somewhat sometimes over the top humor, which Pratchett does so well. But it also had a lot more serious themes. And so reading that and then going to Witches Abroad, which also kind of towed that line, there were definitely some serious moments. There were some darker moments, but still with a lot of humor. And Small Gods really, I feel like even if you don't like the zaniness of a lot of the Discworld novels, this still has some of it, but it's a lot more of a serious kind of story with humor put in. And it's just Pratchett never ceases to amaze me. And the fact that I'm not even that far in, I have so many Discworld novels left to go, and I've just been absolutely loving Discworld lately. So I'm really excited to continue. Lords and Ladies is the one I'll be reading in August for sure, and if I have time, I might jump into Men at Arms as well. I will note, I finally caught up to Drew's book reviews. We had been both reading usually one Discworld book a month, but he was one ahead of me. So I'd always like, I can't watch your review until next month. I'll wait and find it. And I was going that route, but I finally caught up. So we've decided we're just going to be buddy reading in publication order one Discworld book a month from now on. So that'll just be fun to do, so we can chat about it. If you want to do it with us in publication order and happen to randomly be at the same point, or if you read multiple and catch up like I ended up doing, definitely feel free to let us know and check it out. There's a link to, of course, the Wizardly Do a Discord in the description down below. And I'll link out to Drew's channel as well. He's also got a Discord. So if you want to jump in and talk more Discworld, definitely let us know. Of course, if you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a like. And if you'd like to see more of my content, make sure to subscribe.